From his sickbed, the Duke of Kent revealed the Queen's last order about Harry and Meghan Markle. The words that followed would shock even the most seasoned royal observers. According to the Duke, Queen Elizabeth, in her final days, made a decision so uncompromising that it threatened to reshape the very structure of the royal family. Strip them of all titles, she said. Simple, direct, unforgiving. But what did it truly mean for Harry and Meghan? And why had the Queen, who had always valued discretion and measured action, chosen such a decisive path? Imagine the scene. A quiet, dimly lit room in one of the palace wings, the air thick with solemnity. The Duke of Kent, lying on his sickbed, surrounded by the murmurs of concerned aides and the subtle rustle of royal papers, whispers revelations that had been guarded for decades. The Queen's words were not just a reprimand. They were a final command. A warning. A statement etched in the annals of monarchy that would reverberate across continents, across media outlets, and through every household that had watched Harry and Meghan's journey from fairy tale to controversy. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. In the first few seconds of this story, it's impossible not to feel a shiver of curiosity. What could Harry and Meghan have done to earn such a fate? The public knows fragments, the departures from royal duties, the explosive interviews, the memoirs, and the highly publicized media appearances. But what went on behind closed doors? What conversations did the Queen have that the cameras never caught? What letters, diaries, or recordings were kept secret, only to emerge from the shadows now through the Duke's eyes? To understand the gravity of the situation, we need to consider the Queen herself, not the distant, ceremonial figure the public often saw, but Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor. A monarch who carried the weight of the Commonwealth on her shoulders, who had survived wars, personal betrayals, and decades of scrutiny. Her word was law, and her decisions were deliberate. She understood the implications of removing royal titles. She knew that by issuing such an order, she wasn't just punishing Harry and Meghan. She was sending a signal to the entire royal institution. Loyalty and duty were paramount, and any breach would not be tolerated. The Duke of Kent's revelation is more than gossip or palace rumor. It's a window into a world meticulously shielded from public eyes. It tells us that the Queen's final judgment was personal, strategic, and unflinching. According to insiders, she considered Harry and Meghan's actions a profound betrayal, one that threatened the integrity of the monarchy itself. To strip them of titles was to sever their symbolic ties to the institution that had nurtured them, protected them, and, for most of their lives, defined them. But why now? Why in her final days? There's a peculiar intensity in the timing. Many speculate that the Queen's declining health forced clarity. There was no time for ambiguity, no room for compromise. Her message had to be explicit, leaving no chance for misinterpretation. And yet, despite the severity of the order, there's an undeniable sorrow that underpins it. A grief for a family divided, a love betrayed, and a monarchy under pressure. The words, "no title for traitors," are as much a lament as they are a command. They carry the weight of history, tradition, and personal disappointment. And here lies the paradox. The very individuals who had once been adored by the public, the young prince and his American duchess, were now the subject of one of the harshest private judgments in modern royal history. The public had witnessed the fairy tale, the media frenzy, and the eventual exit from royal duties. But few understood the quiet, devastating finality of the Queen's decision. The Duke of Kent, positioned at the intersection of duty and family, became the messenger of a reality that was both painful and unyielding. Audience, consider this. In a world obsessed with scandal, headlines, and instant social media reactions, how does one measure betrayal? Is it the public airing of grievances? The decision to leave tradition behind? Or is it the deeper, more personal choice, the moment when loyalty is questioned and trust is broken? Queen Elizabeth's order suggests that, for her, the breach was not just public, it was profoundly personal. And what of Harry and Meghan? How did they process this? The Duke's account hints at shock, disbelief, and an immediate sense of urgency. Courtiers whispered, aides scrambled, and the media, eventually, began to pick up fragments of a story that had been tightly contained. The tension between private sorrow and public spectacle reached a boiling point. Every decision the couple made from this moment forward was inevitably colored by the Queen's last command. This isn't just a story about royal titles or ceremonial distinctions. It's a story about power, loyalty, betrayal, and consequence. It's about a family at a crossroads, where love, duty, and ambition collide. And it's about the hidden mechanisms of the monarchy, the private conversations, the written orders, the diaries and letters that never see the light of day until now. By revealing this story, the Duke of Kent has unwittingly opened a door few have dared to enter. Behind it lies not just the tale of Harry and Meghan's fall from favor, but the intricate tapestry of relationships, decisions, and regrets that define the modern royal family. It's a glimpse into the human side of a monarchy often seen as untouchable, impervious, and eternal. And yet, as we step further into this tale, questions multiply. Was the Queen's order absolute, or were there nuances hidden within palace protocol? How did other members of the royal family react, and what role did advisors, courtiers, and legal minds play in interpreting and enforcing her will? Could there have been an opportunity for reconciliation, or was the decision irrevocable? The stakes are high, and the consequences are real. Titles are not merely decorative. They carry privilege, recognition, and legacy. Stripping them away is a symbolic severing, an act that communicates disapproval louder than words ever could. For Harry and Meghan, this was not just about public perception. It was about identity, inheritance, and their place in history. And just as the Duke's words began to circulate, the palace held its collective breath. Every whisper, every glance, every unspoken gesture carried weight. The media speculated endlessly, yet even seasoned royal correspondents admitted they had never encountered a revelation so sharp, so intimate, and so final. For the first time, the public glimpsed the monarchy's inner workings, not polished, not ceremonial, but raw and unforgiving. So, as we embark on this story, ask yourself, what would you do if confronted with the ultimate judgment from a family that embodies both love and authority? How do you navigate the fine line between duty and personal happiness, loyalty and independence? The Queen's final order challenges not just Harry and Meghan. It challenges the audience to confront these timeless questions of loyalty, consequence, and legacy. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Courtiers whispered of secret meetings, of letters hidden away, of decisions that would ripple through Buckingham Palace and beyond. And at the center of it all stood the Duke of Kent, the silent witness to history, revealing truths that had been long buried. This is where our story begins. From the dimly lit chamber of the Duke of Kent, the atmosphere was heavy with more than just illness. There was history here. There was secrecy. And now, there was revelation. Few had ever entered these private quarters, and fewer still had been privy to the words about to spill forth. The Duke, once a steadfast observer of royal protocol, now became the unlikely bearer of a bombshell that would shake the foundations of the monarchy. Queen Elizabeth's final command concerning Harry and Meghan Markle. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. The Duke, reclining in his chair, frail but composed, summoned his closest aides. "There are things the public must never hear." "Until now," he murmured. His voice, though weakened by illness, carried the weight of decades spent in service to the crown. Each word seemed carefully measured, yet the gravity of what he was about to disclose could not be contained. "She wanted them stripped of all titles," he said, pausing as if to ensure the words landed. "Everything. Permanently. No exceptions." Even those accustomed to royal secrets felt a chill at the Duke's confession. Stripping titles is no small matter. In the centuries of British monarchy, it has rarely been done. To hear that Queen Elizabeth, the steadfast, unflinching matriarch of the Windsor dynasty, had made such a decision in her final days, was almost unimaginable. And yet, the Duke's presence, his credibility, and the solemnity of the moment left no room for doubt. This was not speculation, nor rumor. It was the truth, direct from the corridors of power. As he spoke, the room seemed to shrink, the air thickening with tension. The aides leaned closer, their pens poised over notebooks, knowing that what they were hearing would soon become one of the most sensational stories in modern royal history. "No title for traitors," the Duke repeated, his words punctuated by a slow, deliberate emphasis. These were not idle words. They were a verdict. The Queen's voice, in this context, echoed through time, blending personal disappointment with the duty-bound severity that had defined her reign. But why would the Queen, in her twilight moments, feel compelled to issue such an uncompromising order? What could have prompted this level of decisive action? To understand, one must look back at the unfolding saga of Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties, the explosive interviews, the memoirs, and the relentless media scrutiny. Each step of their journey had strained the relationship with the palace, but the Queen's decision reflected something deeper than public embarrassment. It was a sense of betrayal. The monarchy, she believed, had been disrespected, its traditions disregarded, its rules flouted. The Duke of Kent, often described as the silent observer of the royal family, had seen it all. He had witnessed the careful orchestration of public appearances, the whispered tensions behind closed doors, and the subtle, unspoken communications that only insiders could interpret. Now, he stood, or rather, reclined, as the messenger of one of the most consequential royal judgments of the century. And in his confession, he revealed not just the order, but the human side of it, the sorrow, the heartbreak, and the anguish that accompanied such a stark decision. He spoke of the Queen in her private chambers, her face a mixture of stoicism and grief. "I had to be clear," she had said, according to the Duke. "There can be no ambiguity. Loyalty must be honored, and betrayal must have consequence." In those words, one can hear the echoes of decades of service, of a life dedicated to the crown, and of a profound disappointment in two of her own grandchildren. The weight of this order was not just administrative, it was intensely personal. The aides in the room felt a mixture of awe and unease. On one hand, they were listening to a revelation that would dominate headlines, rewrite public perception, and alter history. On the other, they were witnessing the fragile humanity of the Duke of Kent, a man torn between loyalty to the monarchy and the gravity of disclosing such intimate knowledge. His hands shook slightly as he held the letter detailing the Queen's order, a document that had been locked away, hidden from public view, until now. "This isn't just about titles," the Duke explained, his voice now a whisper meant more for the record than for anyone else. "It's about legacy, about what it means to be part of this family, to be entrusted with history, and to uphold it. To disregard, that is to disregard the very foundation upon which our monarchy stands." His words lingered in the air like a heavy fog, enveloping everyone present in a mixture of reverence and disbelief. He recounted how the Queen had wrestled with this decision for months. It was not impulsive. It was not reactive. It was deliberate, considered, and absolute. She had weighed every consequence, every possible reconciliation, every alternative. And in the end, she concluded that the only path that maintained the dignity and authority of the crown was a complete and permanent stripping of Harry and Meghan's titles. The aides listened, captivated, as the Duke continued. He described the secretive communications, the private meetings with advisors, and the confidential memos sent throughout the palace. Each note, each discussion, reinforced the Queen's position. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was an irrevocable act, designed to send a message to the royal family, the public, and the world. Yet, amidst the gravity of these revelations, there was an undercurrent of tension, almost cinematic in its intensity. The Duke paused frequently, as though weighing the impact of his words. "It's not just about power," he said finally, looking each aide in the eye. "It's about trust. And trust, once broken, cannot simply be restored." He hinted at private conversations with Harry and Meghan, conversations that would never be fully disclosed to the public. The couple, he suggested, were stunned, blindsided even. They had perhaps anticipated public criticism, media scrutiny, or even mild censure, but not this. A command from the Queen herself, enshrined in writing, meant to permanently sever their symbolic ties to the monarchy. Audience, consider this. What does it feel like to be on the receiving end of such an order? Imagine the shock, the disbelief, the sense of betrayal. The Duke's words invite us to ponder this human drama, beyond the public spectacle, beyond the tabloids and television cameras. At the center is a family torn apart by ambition, expectation, and the relentless weight of history. And then came the silence. The aides, absorbing the enormity of what they had just heard, were careful not to speak. The room seemed to shrink around them. as though the very walls were listening, as though the weight of history itself had descended. The Duke, his frailty now more apparent than ever, leaned back and exhaled slowly. "This is the truth," he said. "It must be known. And yet, it must also be handled with care. Because once it leaves these walls, there is no going back." This was not a story of mere scandal or intrigue. It was a story of power, consequence, and the irrevocable decisions that shape history. It was about a monarch who had spent her life balancing love, duty, and the expectations of an entire nation, and who, in her final days, had made a choice that would forever mark the narrative of her family. And just as the Duke's words began to circulate beyond the walls of his chamber, the palace braced itself. Courtiers whispered of impending media storms, of legal challenges, and of the inevitable public fascination. Harry and Meghan's circle, upon hearing fragments of the revelation, were said to have been thrown into turmoil, scrambling to understand the scope and implications of the Queen's command. Yet, the most shocking elements were still to come. The Duke hinted at letters hidden away in palace archives, diaries locked in private drawers, and conversations never intended for public consumption. These were not mere documents. They were pieces of a puzzle, pieces that, when finally revealed, would offer insights into the motivations, regrets, and calculations of a monarch at the end of her remarkable life. And here lies the heart of the story, the tension between the public and private spheres. The world saw Harry and Meghan's fairy tale romance, their charismatic public appearances, and their eventual departure from royal duties. Few, however, grasped the private storm brewing behind closed doors, a storm now laid bare by the Duke of Kent. It is a story that challenges perceptions, questions loyalties, and exposes the raw, human emotions that underpin even the most stoic of royal figures. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace was on edge. Letters, diaries, and confidences held for decades suddenly took on new significance. Decisions that had been private, discreet, and carefully measured were now thrust into the spotlight. And at the center of this maelstrom stood the Duke of Kent, whose sickbed confession had ignited a cascade of revelations, forever altering the story of Harry, Meghan, and the legacy of Queen Elizabeth herself. The story of Queen Elizabeth's disappointment in Harry and Meghan is not one of a sudden rift, but a slow, mounting frustration that stretched over years. To truly understand the weight of her final command, one must step inside the Queen's perspective, the life she lived, the standards she upheld, and the expectations she placed upon her family. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was not just a figurehead. She was a woman who bore the crown's legacy on her shoulders, whose life was defined by duty, loyalty, and an unshakable sense of responsibility. To her, the monarchy was more than tradition. It was a sacred institution, a contract between the crown and the people, and betrayal of that trust was, in her eyes, unforgivable. From the very beginning of Harry and Meghan's entry into the royal fold, the Queen's guidance had been measured and deliberate. She extended warmth, inclusion, and mentorship, showing patience for youthful indiscretions and missteps. She welcomed Meghan into the family, attended countless events to show support, and provided counsel when tensions arose. Yet, as time progressed, the Queen's initial hope began to erode. What had started as concern over minor miscommunications became a deep-seated unease. It was not merely the public controversies, the media scrutiny, or the glaring headlines. It was a fundamental breach of expectation, a deviation from the unwritten codes that had long governed royal behavior. The Duke of Kent's revelations paint a vivid picture of a monarch weighed down by disappointment. He described private conversations in which the Queen voiced her frustration not just at Harry's decisions, but also at Meghan's approach to royal life. "I raised them, I trusted them, and yet they chose to disregard everything we stand for," she reportedly said, her voice tinged with both sorrow and stern resolve. These were not the words of anger alone. They were the measured reflection of someone who understood that actions have consequences, sometimes irreversible ones. It's easy, from a distance, to interpret Harry and Meghan's decisions as acts of independence, of carving a life outside the shadow of royal protocol. But for the Queen, this independence was a betrayal of principle. The monarchy's strength, she knew, rested on unity, discretion, and adherence to a strict moral code. To break from tradition publicly, to engage in what she perceived as manipulative media strategies, and to challenge long-held norms was to jeopardize the institution she had nurtured for decades. In her eyes, this was not mere youthful rebellion. It was a threat to continuity, respect, and the very foundation of the crown. The Duke of Kent, privy to the Queen's innermost thoughts, explained how her disappointment had grown over the years, fed by repeated instances that clashed with her expectations. There were the televised interviews where private family grievances were aired to the world. There were memoirs that recast history with personal interpretations, often casting the monarchy in a less than flattering light. There were decisions that, while perhaps well-intentioned, seemed calculated to challenge the traditional structure of the family. To the Queen, these were not isolated incidents. They were a pattern, a clear signal that trust had been violated. What made her disappointment even more poignant was its personal nature. The Queen was not a distant observer. She was a grandmother, a matriarch, and a woman deeply invested in the welfare of her family. Her disappointment was tinged with grief. The words, "no title for traitors," which would later emerge through the Duke's account, were born not only of protocol but also of heartbreak. She had watched as relationships strained, as public perception skewed, and as loyalty wavered. The Queen had devoted her life to an institution larger than herself, yet she had hoped her own family would share that sense of responsibility and reverence. When that expectation faltered, disappointment was inevitable. The Duke's recounting of private palace meetings adds layers of understanding to this narrative. He described the Queen meeting with her senior advisors, discussing the growing tensions, and contemplating the consequences of Harry and Meghan's choices. She considered compromise, avenues for reconciliation, and even quiet interventions. But each attempt, each gesture, seemed to be met with a continued pattern of decisions that defied her guidance. Over time, hope gave way to resolve, and resolve hardened into a decision that would become her final, enduring statement. It is important to note that the Queen's disappointment was not driven by personal dislike or bias. Those closest to her emphasized that Elizabeth was capable of great affection, of generosity of spirit, and of forgiveness. Yet, she measured her personal feelings against the broader responsibilities of her role. When actions threatened the monarchy's reputation, she did not hesitate. The stakes were higher than family tensions. They encompassed the stability of the institution, the trust of her subjects, and the historical legacy she had worked so hard to preserve. From the Duke's perspective, this context is crucial. The public may have seen media controversies, sensational headlines, and social media uproar. What they did not see was the careful, deliberate contemplation that underpinned the Queen's decisions. Every conversation, every sigh, every expression of disappointment had been weighed against decades of experience, historical precedent, and the understanding that royal duty often demands sacrifices that ordinary families never encounter. In detailing the Queen's feelings, the Duke also offered glimpses of her humanity. There were moments of private tears, of whispered regrets, and of questioning whether her actions would be understood. Yet, despite the emotional burden, she remained resolute. To compromise now would risk setting a precedent that could weaken the monarchy for generations. And so, her disappointment, steeped in grief, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal, manifested in a decision that would irrevocably alter the lives of Harry and Meghan. The Duke spoke of the Queen's conversations with other family members as well. He described meetings with Prince Charles, Prince William, and Princess Anne, where she expressed her profound disappointment. Each discussion was layered with nuance. The Queen sought advice, she weighed perspectives, and she ensured that her words were measured yet unambiguous. The consistent theme, however, was clear. Harry and Meghan had crossed a line, and the consequences would be permanent. Audience, pause for a moment and reflect. How often does disappointment become a catalyst for irrevocable decisions? In this case, the Queen's disappointment was more than emotional. It was a guiding principle. It dictated strategy, shaped outcomes, and influenced the internal dynamics of the family. Every step she took was carefully calculated, balancing personal feelings with institutional duty. Yet, disappointment alone does not fully explain the Queen's actions. The Duke's recounting hints at a layered narrative, one that involves concerns over public image, media manipulation, and the long-term implications of Harry and Meghan's choices. The Queen was acutely aware of how actions taken in private would inevitably spill into the public domain, influencing perceptions of the monarchy worldwide. Her disappointment, therefore, was coupled with an acute awareness of consequence, a recognition that inaction could be more damaging than decisive intervention. The emotional beats are striking. Imagine the Queen, a woman who had endured wars, family crises, and decades of relentless scrutiny, now grappling with the realization that her own grandchildren might undermine the very institution she had dedicated her life to protecting. It is a testament to the human side of royalty, the tension between love and duty, between personal affection and institutional responsibility. And as the Duke of Kent recounted these moments, the weight of the Queen's disappointment became palpable. It was not the disappointment of a distant monarch. It was the disappointment of a grandmother, a sovereign, and a woman who understood the stakes of history. Every sigh, every furrowed brow, every pause in conversation conveyed a depth of emotion that few outside the palace walls could ever imagine. But what made this chapter of royal history so gripping was not just the disappointment itself, it was what it precipitated. The Queen's dissatisfaction was the precursor to her final, unyielding decision, the order to strip Harry and Meghan of their titles. This act, so absolute, was not merely administrative. It was deeply personal, the culmination of years of observation, hope, and heartbreak. The Duke's sickbed confession makes it clear that the Queen's disappointment was both the seed and the catalyst for one of the most dramatic turns in modern royal history. And yet, even as the Duke's words spread, the palace held its collective breath. Questions swirled. How would Harry and Meghan respond? How would the public react? Would this decision stand, or could it be challenged? The tension was electric, a story unfolding in real time, with consequences that would ripple through generations. But the most shocking elements were yet to come. The Queen's disappointment, though already profound, set the stage for revelations that would expose not just the actions of her grandchildren, but the intricate web of palace protocol, family dynamics, and historical precedent. And as the Duke's account concludes, one fact is undeniable. The Queen's disappointment was the quiet but unyielding force behind a command that would leave an indelible mark on the monarchy. The moment the words left the Queen's lips, or, more accurately, were penned in her final private notes, they carried a weight heavier than any crown could bear. No title for traitors. Simple, stern, absolute. In those 4 words lay the culmination of disappointment, authority, and an unyielding commitment to the institution she had dedicated her life to preserving. But what did those words truly signify for Harry and Meghan, and for the monarchy as a whole? According to the Duke of Kent, the order was not a casual reprimand, nor was it the result of a passing frustration. It was deliberate, premeditated, and irreversible. The Queen, even in her declining health, understood the immense symbolism embedded in royal titles. They are more than mere decorations or honors. They are public affirmations of trust, responsibility, and legacy. To remove them is to strip not only privilege but identity, history, and belonging. The Duke recounted how he first became aware of the order. It was a quiet afternoon in one of the palace's lesser-known wings, a room bathed in soft light, where the Queen had requested a private meeting with him. Her demeanor was composed but resolute. She spoke not in anger, but in the calm, authoritative tone that had defined her reign. "Kent," she said, "there is no place for those who undermine the crown from within. I have made my decision. It is final. Harry and Meghan will have no titles. None. Forever." Imagine the shock, even for someone like the Duke, who had spent a lifetime observing the nuances of royal life. These were not the words of a fleeting emotion. They were the words of a sovereign issuing a final judgment. And they were not meant to be challenged. This was the ultimate exercise of authority, where personal sentiment was subordinated to duty, and the weight of the monarchy eclipsed family ties. Audience, pause for a moment. Consider the psychological impact of such a declaration. Titles are identity, recognition, and privilege all wrapped into one. To lose them is to lose a connection to lineage, to responsibility, and to a legacy that spans centuries. For Harry and Meghan, the order was not just symbolic, it was profoundly personal. It represented a severing of bonds, an erasure of acknowledgement from the very matriarch who had once embraced them warmly. The Duke's account reveals another layer, the meticulous nature of the Queen's decision-making. She consulted advisors, legal experts, and senior family members, ensuring that her decree would withstand scrutiny and enforceability. There were letters drafted, meetings conducted, and protocols established to implement the order. Nothing was left to chance. Every detail, from wording to timing, was calculated to ensure clarity and permanence. But why such severity? Why not a warning, a temporary suspension, or a private reprimand? The answer, according to the Duke, lies in the Queen's understanding of precedent and consequence. The monarchy, she knew, relies on perception as much as protocol. To allow exceptions or leniency in this case would signal weakness, invite future challenges, and potentially erode the credibility of the institution. By making the order absolute, she reinforced a message that loyalty and duty are non-negotiable. Betrayal, she conveyed, carries an undeniable cost. The emotional undertones of this order are equally significant. The Duke spoke of the Queen's grief, subtle but undeniable, as she reconciled her affection for her grandchildren with her duty to the crown. "I love them," she reportedly said in private. But love does not absolve actions that threaten everything we uphold. In those words, we see the duality that defines the monarchy, the tension between personal affection and institutional responsibility, between family and history. Interestingly, the Duke highlighted the reactions within the palace. Some aides and courtiers were taken aback by the unyielding nature of the command. They had expected some negotiation, some softer language, perhaps even a temporary measure. Instead, the Queen's words left no ambiguity. The order was absolute. It was not negotiable. And, as the Duke emphasized, it was binding. There is also the matter of historical comparison. Stripping titles is rare, but not unprecedented. The Duke provided examples from history. Earlier monarchs who had removed titles as punishment for disloyalty or scandal. Yet, what makes this case extraordinary is the combination of timing, personal relation, and public visibility. The Queen's decision was final, written in the twilight of her life, and it directly targeted two high-profile figures whose actions had attracted global attention. The convergence of personal disappointment, institutional necessity, and historical precedent made this order uniquely powerful. Moreover, the order was both symbolic and practical. Beyond removing titles, it curtailed privileges, financial entitlements, and ceremonial participation. It reshaped the couple's relationship with the monarchy on every level, from public appearances to private inheritance. The Duke of Kent described how these measures were carefully drafted, ensuring that the order could withstand both legal and public scrutiny, and that it would send an unambiguous message to the world. Audience, ask yourself, what would it feel like to be told that your place within a family, your titles, and your symbolic identity were permanently revoked? How would this affect your sense of belonging, purpose, and legacy? For Harry and Meghan, this was not a theoretical exercise, it was reality. And for the monarchy, it was a statement that reinforced the primacy of duty, respect, and loyalty. The Duke also revealed the Queen's emotional reasoning behind the choice of words. "Traitors," she said. "Not rebels. Not dissenters. Traitors." A word heavy with history, with consequence, with moral judgment. In that single term, the Queen encapsulated betrayal, breach of trust, and the gravity of undermining the institution from within. It was not an accusation lightly made. It was a declaration meant to define the moral and ethical boundaries of the royal family for generations to come. And yet, the execution of the order was as delicate as it was severe. The Duke explained that it had to be delivered in a way that respected protocol, minimized scandal, and maintained the dignity of the monarchy. Letters were drafted, communications carefully managed, and senior family members briefed. The goal was to ensure that while the order was unambiguous, the process remained orderly, respectful, and in accordance with centuries of tradition. But even with all the planning, the emotional impact was unavoidable. Courtiers whispered of sleepless nights, of meetings fraught with tension, and of the palpable sense of shock that rippled through the palace. Harry and Meghan, when eventually informed, were said to be stunned. The gravity of the Queen's final command, as described by the Duke, left them reeling, forced to confront the reality of losing not only titles, but the symbolic connection to their family, their heritage, and the monarchy itself. In retelling this story, the Duke emphasized the intersection of personal and institutional consequence. The order was a reminder that in the monarchy, actions carry weight beyond personal relationships. Choices are public, and loyalty is not optional. Titles are privileges, yes, but they are also responsibilities, symbols of trust, and indicators of commitment to the institution. To violate that trust is to forfeit the honor entirely. And yet, the drama was only beginning. The Duke's account hinted at further complexities: letters hidden in archives, secret meetings among courtiers, and debates within the palace about how to implement and enforce the order. These layers added intrigue, tension, and anticipation, signaling that the story of the Queen's final command was far from over. But what came next would test the resolve of everyone involved, and it would challenge public assumptions about loyalty, family, and the monarchy itself. The order was issued, the words etched in history, and the consequences were inevitable. The stage was set for a confrontation that would span continents, media outlets, and decades of public fascination. And at the center of it all stood the Duke of Kent, whose sickbed confession had revealed a truth so striking, so absolute, that the world could not look away. When the Queen's final order reached the ears of those within the palace walls, the reaction was immediate, electric, and in many ways, unprecedented. Courtiers, aides, and senior staff alike were stunned. Even those accustomed to the secrecy, discipline, and rituals of royal life were unprepared for the absolute nature of the decree. Harry and Meghan were to be stripped of all titles, permanently. The phrase "no title for traitors" reverberated through corridors that had, for centuries, been accustomed to whispers, rumors, and delicate negotiations, but rarely such blunt finality. The initial reaction was disbelief. How could the Queen, known for her patience and measured approach, have taken such a stark position? Many within the palace struggled to reconcile the stern command with the woman they had served for decades, the sovereign who had weathered wars, family scandals, and decades of scrutiny with composure. Yet, the Duke of Kent's account confirmed that this was no momentary impulse. The Queen's decision was deliberate, premeditated, and absolute. Staffers described hushed conversations in dimly lit corridors, aides consulting with one another in hurried whispers, and courtiers exchanging incredulous glances. The palace, usually a bastion of order and ceremony, seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the most senior members of the royal household, familiar with crisis management and media storms, were unsettled by the magnitude of the Queen's final decision. The Duke recalled moments of stunned silence, punctuated by quiet questions. How will they take this? Is this really happening? What will the public say? Some aides feared the immediate fallout. The monarchy operates not only on tradition, but also on perception. Every decision, every announcement, every private action has the potential to ripple outward, influencing public opinion, media narratives, and international relations. Stripping Harry and Meghan of their titles was not simply a familial punishment. It was a calculated statement to the world. It said, unequivocally, that loyalty and duty are non-negotiable, and that breaches of trust carry real, irreversible consequences. Yet the shockwaves extended beyond staffers and advisors. Members of the royal family themselves were forced to confront the magnitude of the decision. Prince Charles, Prince William, and Princess Anne were all briefed in private. The Duke of Kent described tense conversations, where the Queen's reasoning was explained, dissected, and debated in hushed tones. Each family member was tasked with understanding the necessity of the order while grappling with its personal and emotional implications. Some were sympathetic to the Queen's perspective, recognizing the threat to tradition and reputation. Others were quietly concerned about the human cost, aware that this decree would fracture familial bonds in ways that might never be repaired. The media, of course, was another force entirely. While the Queen's order remained private for a time, whispers inevitably leaked. Journalists, sensing a story of monumental significance, began to probe sources, seek confirmation, and anticipate the public reaction. Headlines that would eventually shock the world began to take shape behind the scenes. The heir apparent's children embroiled in controversy, a beloved duchess stripped of privilege, a prince forced to reckon with public and familial judgment. The palace, already tense, now had to contend with the inevitability of public scrutiny. Amidst the chaos, courtiers worked tirelessly to manage optics and protocol. Letters were drafted to ensure that the formalities of the order were legally and ceremonially sound. Advisors coordinated messaging, ensuring that when the story inevitably broke, it would be framed in a manner that emphasized duty, precedent, and institutional integrity rather than personal vendetta. Yet, even with meticulous planning, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of anxiety. How would Harry and Meghan respond? How would supporters and critics alike interpret this act? Could the monarchy withstand the inevitable storm of public opinion? The Duke of Kent painted a vivid picture of palace life during this period. Servants whispered in hallways, courtiers lingered outside meeting rooms to catch snippets of discussion, and aides worked around the clock to ensure that every detail of the Queen's order was executed flawlessly. Even the smallest gestures, a note left on a desk, a quiet consultation with a legal advisor, took on outsized significance. The weight of history pressed down on everyone within those walls. One particularly striking moment, as recounted by the Duke, involved a private meeting of senior aides where the implications of the Queen's order were laid bare. Questions abounded. How would this affect the line of succession? What precedent did this set for future generations? Could there be legal challenges? Could Harry or Meghan contest the decision in court, or would public opinion force a reconsideration? The atmosphere was tense, almost cinematic, as staffers realized that they were witnessing the consequences of a monarch's final, unyielding judgment. Interestingly, the Duke noted a mixture of respect and fear among palace staff. The Queen had long commanded loyalty, but the absolute nature of this order heightened the stakes. Many felt a profound sense of awe at her decisiveness, tempered by concern over the potential fallout. This duality, fear and respect, is emblematic of the monarchy's inner workings, where personal loyalty and institutional necessity often intersect in ways that outsiders rarely comprehend. And what of Harry and Meghan? Their circle, upon learning fragments of the Queen's decision, reportedly reacted with shock, disbelief, and an immediate sense of urgency. Conversations were held, strategizing occurred, and advisors worked to understand both the practical and symbolic consequences of the order. The Duke's account hints at a mixture of anger and sorrow from the couple, as they grappled with the reality that their royal titles, the very symbols of their connection to the crown, had been permanently removed. The ripple effects extended even further. Friends, business associates, and international media began to speculate, creating a storm that tested the monarchy's ability to manage both perception and precedent. Social media buzzed with theories, rumors, and speculation, while mainstream outlets scrambled to verify the story. The palace, accustomed to secrecy, found itself navigating an unprecedented challenge, controlling the narrative of a decree that had personal, institutional, and global ramifications. Yet, amidst the chaos, the Duke emphasized one consistent theme. The Queen's authority was absolute. Her decision, though shocking, was final. There was no room for negotiation, compromise, or delay. The palace, while managing optics, understood this implicitly. This was a sovereign speaking not merely as a grandmother, but as the ultimate custodian of tradition, protocol, and history. Audience, consider the tension, courtiers whispering in corridors, advisors reviewing legal implications, media speculation mounting, and the public poised to react. Every action had consequences. Every leak, every rumor, every statement could shift perception and alter the trajectory of history. The palace, a world defined by order and control, was now navigating uncharted territory. And then came the quiet aftermath. Staffers and courtiers began to process the personal dimensions of the decision. Some felt sympathy for Harry and Meghan, recognizing the emotional toll of losing titles and privileges. Others understood the necessity of upholding the monarchy's integrity. The balance between personal loyalty and institutional duty became a defining tension in the palace, creating an undercurrent of unease that would last for months, if not years. The Duke also revealed moments of irony and subtle humor amidst the tension. Courtiers, accustomed to formality, were now negotiating unusual situations. How to communicate the decree delicately, how to maintain protocol while enforcing the order, and how to anticipate public reaction. The interplay of solemnity and human error added a layer of complexity, illustrating the challenging intersection of tradition and emotion. Ultimately, the palace's reaction and the shockwaves that followed highlighted a critical truth. The Queen's final command was not just a private family matter. It was a defining moment for the monarchy, a statement about loyalty, duty, and consequence. It set a precedent, reshaped relationships, and tested the resilience of an institution built over centuries. But what came next would escalate the tension even further. Letters hidden in archives, private meetings, and undisclosed conversations hinted at additional layers of intrigue. The public had yet to see the full scope of the impact, and Harry and Meghan's response would soon add another chapter to a story that was already historic. Within the stately walls of Buckingham Palace, amidst tapestries that told stories of kings and queens, battles won and alliances forged, there exists another kind of history, one hidden, private, and often never meant to see the light of day. Diaries tucked away in ornate desks, letters folded and sealed in drawers, whispered conversations in shadowed corridors. All of these formed a secret record of the monarchy, a record that now, thanks to the Duke of Kent, was beginning to surface. The Duke revealed that some of the most significant insights into Queen Elizabeth's decision regarding Harry and Meghan came not from public statements or media releases, but from these hidden documents. Diaries kept over decades provided a window into her private thoughts, her judgments, and, most importantly, her expectations of her family. These weren't the polished, ceremonial speeches delivered to Parliament or the public. These were raw, unfiltered glimpses into the mind of a woman who had carried the weight of a nation and a dynasty for decades. According to the Duke, one diary entry in particular painted a stark picture of her frustration. Dated a few weeks before the Queen's death, the entry reflected both sorrow and determination. She wrote about the disheartening pattern she had observed in her grandchildren's behavior, noting moments of disloyalty and public actions that contradicted the values of the crown. In one passage, she referenced Harry's repeated engagements with media outlets that, in her view, compromised the dignity of the family. In another, she lamented Meghan's attempts to influence public perception through strategic media appearances, describing them as calculated, if misguided, attempts to reshape narratives that should remain sacred. These diaries, the Duke explained, were not mere venting sessions. They were documents of deliberation, planning, and moral reasoning. Each entry built upon the last, forming a timeline that revealed how the Queen's disappointment had slowly solidified into conviction and eventually into the decisive order to strip Harry and Meghan of their titles. It was as though every word she wrote served as a rehearsal, preparing her for the final judgment that would shake the palace to its core. Beyond written records, there were conversations, secret, whispered, and sometimes tense, between the Queen and her closest confidants. The Duke described meetings with senior advisors and courtiers, often held in secluded rooms away from prying eyes. In these discussions, the Queen expressed her concerns, sought counsel, and weighed every possible consequence. But what emerges most clearly from the Duke's account is the personal dimension of these deliberations. She did not issue her final order lightly. It was born of reflection, principle, and, yes, heartbreak. One particularly revealing anecdote involved a late-night consultation with Princess Anne. The Queen, fatigued but resolute, reportedly confided, "I do not wish to harm them, yet their actions leave me no choice. History will judge, and the family must remain intact in purpose, if not in proximity." In this moment, we glimpse the paradox of monarchy, love and duty, personal affection and institutional responsibility, coexisting in a delicate, often painful balance. Hidden letters further illuminate the Queen's mindset. Some were written directly to Harry and Meghan, never intended for public view. The tone of these letters was firm yet tinged with sorrow, emphasizing expectations, responsibilities, and the moral obligations of royalty. They were reminders of the standards the couple had vowed to uphold, documents that reflect both disappointment and the hope that reconciliation might be possible, so long as the breaches of trust were acknowledged and corrected. Audience, imagine receiving such a letter, knowing it came from the matriarch of one of the oldest and most scrutinized families in the world. How would it feel to be confronted with both love and rebuke in the same breath? The diaries and letters reveal that for the Queen, this was not merely about enforcing protocol. It was about guiding her family, even in the most difficult moments, toward a path that preserved dignity, trust, and historical continuity. The Duke also recounted that some conversations, overheard by trusted aides or recorded in personal journals, hinted at the depth of the Queen's emotional struggle. She reflected on the delicate nature of public image, the fragility of trust, and the consequences of actions that might seem private but have far-reaching implications. Each conversation, each note, added layers to the narrative, offering insights into the thought process behind the irrevocable order. It was during one such private conversation that the Duke described a pivotal moment. The Queen, speaking quietly to a senior advisor, reportedly said, "I have loved them as my grandchildren, but I cannot allow sentiment to dictate the legacy of the monarchy. They must understand the gravity of their choices, and the consequences must be clear." These words, whispered in confidence, foreshadowed the formal decree that would later be confirmed through official channels and disseminated to the palace staff. The hidden records also reveal a strategic mind at work. The Queen anticipated potential challenges, legal, public, and familial. She meticulously documented her reasoning, ensuring that when the order was finally issued, it would be defensible, comprehensible, and, most importantly, absolute. There was an awareness that Harry and Meghan's response could be both immediate and far-reaching, and she sought to create a framework that left no room for ambiguity. One particularly intriguing revelation from the Duke involved a set of letters never sent. These drafts, prepared in advance of the final order, contained warnings, reminders, and entreaties to Harry and Meghan. The language was both measured and firm, reflecting a sovereign who understood that words could carry consequences as weighty as actions. Though these letters were never dispatched, they illustrate the careful planning and emotional labor that went into the Queen's decision-making process. Moreover, the Duke's account underscores the importance of timing. The Queen did not issue the order impulsively or in response to a single incident. Instead, it was the culmination of years of observation, reflection, and moral reasoning. Each diary entry, each whispered conversation, and each letter contributed to a growing sense of inevitability, a recognition that the only way to preserve both the dignity of the crown and the integrity of her family's legacy was to act decisively. Audience, consider the delicate tension in these hidden layers. On one hand, you have a monarch expressing grief, frustration, and love. On the other, you have an institution demanding accountability, clarity, and permanence. The diaries and conversations expose this duality, offering an intimate look at the human side of a decision that, in public, might appear cold or impersonal. And yet, the Duke hinted at even deeper secrets. Mentions of documents tucked away in private drawers, conversations recorded in confidence, and memories shared only with those closest to the Queen. These fragments, he suggested, could reveal even more about the motivations behind the order, the personal anguish it caused, and the potential consequences for the entire family. They form a hidden tapestry, a narrative of strategy, emotion, and foresight, all of which culminated in the Queen's unyielding decree. But what came next would push the royal family, and the palace staff, into uncharted territory. The Queen's hidden diaries and secret conversations were only the beginning. Once the order became known, it would ignite responses, reactions, and confrontations that few had anticipated. And at the center of it all stood the Duke of Kent, whose willingness to speak from his sickbed had brought these private revelations into the public eye, forever altering the perception of one of the most iconic families in history. The Queen's final order reverberated far beyond the ornate walls of Buckingham Palace, crossing oceans and time zones, landing with undeniable force in Montecito, California. For Harry and Meghan, the news was a jolt, a confrontation with reality that demanded they reassess everything: their identity, their choices, and their place within a family whose judgment could not be ignored. According to the Duke of Kent, their initial reaction was one of shock. They had anticipated criticism, even public censure, but nothing could have prepared them for the absolute, unyielding nature of the command. They were to be stripped of all titles, permanently. The couple's first response was disbelief. Harry, the younger son of the late Princess Diana and Prince Charles, had grown up understanding the weight of duty, protocol, and the monarchy's expectations. Yet, even he was stunned by the severity of the Queen's decision. He reportedly expressed a mixture of anger, confusion, and hurt, a combination that mirrored Meghan's own response. Meghan, the American-born Duchess, had navigated her own share of public scrutiny, media attention, and social pressure. But the absolute severance of royal privileges hit at the very heart of her life's trajectory. In the quiet of their Montecito home, aides described long, tense conversations between the couple. They questioned the fairness of the order, debated its implications, and tried to anticipate its social, financial, and symbolic consequences. For Harry, there was a sense of personal betrayal, a feeling that the family he had once trusted had now rejected him in the most public of ways. For Meghan, the order was both a shock and a call to strategic reflection. How would they respond publicly? How would they manage media narratives? How would they protect themselves while navigating a family whose influence was global? According to the Duke, their response was deliberate, measured, and reflective. They did not immediately issue statements, make public appearances, or retaliate in interviews. Instead, they processed the order privately, considering both short-term and long-term ramifications. The gravity of losing their titles, symbols of heritage, privilege, and connection to a centuries-old institution, was not just administrative. It was profoundly personal. It struck at the very core of identity, leaving them to question what it truly meant to be part of the royal family, when your place could be revoked with a single, unyielding command. The emotional complexity was intense. Harry reportedly felt a mixture of guilt and defiance. Guilt for the public controversies that had contributed to the Queen's disappointment. Defiance in facing what he perceived as an overly harsh judgment. Meghan, meanwhile, grappled with a sense of isolation, understanding that the order was as much about history, tradition, and expectation as it was about her and Harry personally. Their shared grief, disappointment, and resolve created a private storm, one that would shape their future actions and public narratives. Yet even in their shock, there was awareness. They understood, as the Duke described, that the Queen's decision was informed by decades of precedent, family tradition, and institutional necessity. They were not dealing with a personal vendetta, but with a monarch safeguarding the integrity of an institution older than either of them could fully comprehend. This realization did not soften the blow, but it informed their next steps. They needed strategy, foresight, and a careful approach to protect both themselves and their legacy. Audience, consider for a moment the psychological and emotional weight of this moment. To be stripped of symbols that once defined your status, identity, and role in one of the most scrutinized families in the world. It is a humiliation, a shock, and a challenge all at once. How would you respond if confronted with an irrevocable decree from the matriarch of your family, a figure whose authority spans decades and whose judgment is final? This is the human drama at the heart of Harry and Meghan's story, a narrative often overshadowed by media spectacle, but central to understanding their perspective. The Duke of Kent recounted that the couple's circle of advisors became immediately active. Legal counsel was consulted, communications teams began drafting potential responses, and private discussions with close confidants ensued. The goal was to navigate a path that respected the monarchy's authority while preserving their dignity, security, and autonomy. Every decision they made, from private conversations to public statements, was filtered through the lens of the Queen's final order. Interestingly, the Duke also highlighted moments of introspection and self-reflection for Harry and Meghan. Harry, particularly, is said to have grappled with the legacy of his mother, Princess Diana, understanding that public perception and private family dynamics were deeply intertwined. He recognized that his actions had contributed to the Queen's disappointment and that any response would need to be measured, strategic, and, perhaps most importantly, dignified. Meghan, known for her media acumen and personal resilience, reportedly focused on crafting a narrative that balanced personal grief with public image management, knowing that their every move would be analyzed globally. The couple's private discussions also revealed their awareness of the broader consequences. Stripped titles were not merely symbolic. They impacted security arrangements, ceremonial roles, financial privileges, and public duties. The realization that their lives would be fundamentally altered, both legally and socially, added layers of urgency and tension. Every action they considered was weighed against these realities, creating a complex web of emotional, strategic, and ethical considerations. According to the Duke, their private processing of the Queen's order was punctuated by moments of doubt, frustration, and even fleeting despair. They questioned whether reconciliation was possible, whether the order could be softened, and whether public perception could be managed. Yet, within these moments of vulnerability, there was also resilience. They recognized that they had choices: to accept, to fight, or to navigate a middle ground. Their decisions would ultimately define not only their relationship with the monarchy, but also their global image and legacy. Audience, reflect on the tension inherent in this scenario. Here were two individuals, globally recognized, simultaneously negotiating grief, public scrutiny, and institutional authority. The stakes were immense, the consequences far-reaching, and the pressure unrelenting. How do you act when every decision is scrutinized, every emotion analyzed, and every response amplified by global media?